Good morning, everybody. My name is Malcolm Graham Wood. I run a business called Hydrocarbon Capital, advising the energy industry and companies within it. And I also write a blog called Malky's Blog. Most days it would be almost written by now, but I hope it will be later on. Thank you very much. I'm very honoured and fortunate to have an extremely distinguished panel this morning for our discussion entitled UK Opportunities, Understanding the Role Gas Could Play in UK Energy Security, which is obviously pretty critical at present. What I'm going to do is ask each of the panel to say a few words about themselves, their business and their expertise. We'll take questions from the audience after that, and I'm sure that under the circumstances we'll have a lively discussion. On the panel we have the ever-present Francis Egan, who is the CEO of Quadrilla, and who hasn't heard of him lately, or Quadrilla, and I'm sure it'll be an exciting few words. We have Julian Ball, who is the Managing Director and Co-Head of Investments at Kerrigan Capital, also particularly pertinent panelee because of his investments, or Kerrigan's investments in these businesses. In many ways he's financing the gas players presenting here and in adjacent companies. And finally we've got William Powell, who's the Editor-in-Chief of Natural Gas World, who I can reliably say has forgotten more about gas than most of us know, and he will also have I know he's got some very exciting things to say. If I can ask the panelists to say a few words, then I'll open it up to the floor for discussion. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everyone. So thank you for the introduction. I was at a meeting recently, and I'll repeat what I said there, which is that I left the oil and gas industry about 5 years ago and joined the entertainment business. And if I was being paid by the BBC instead of my shareholders, they'd have a large invoice by now. But aside from all that you read or hear in the press, we are actually making very good progress in Lancashire in our shale gas license there. We have drilled the first 2 horizontal wells ever drilled into shale successfully. That wasn't a technically a given, but we have done it. We've logged and cored it. We've got all the data that we need out of it. And despite what you might read about earthquakes in the again on the BBC News, we are fracturing the rock as we speak, and it's fracturing very well. We're already seeing hydrocarbon in the flowback fluid, limited flowback that we've made to date. But it is nonetheless the case that operating within a 0.5 microseismic traffic light is perhaps the most challenging hydrocarbon fracturing operation ever undertaken, in the millions undertaken, but we're doing it. And work in progress. And I might just stop there, and I'm sure we'll have some questions and comments later on.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and many thanks to the organisers for inviting me. I'm a journalist. I've been writing about gas globally for about 20 years and looking at it in the UK. Obviously, with the what's on the agenda today is all very pertinent. There's the Rough storage, which used to supply a large part of UK winter seasonal supply. That's been closed down because it's just too old. We've got very narrow winter-summer price differentials, so there's no real investment in storage. Most of the storage on the continent is being filled up by Gazprom, which has been operating in winter mode over the course of the summer, experiencing record flows this year, breaking last year's record. So there's a lot of gas coming into Europe, but there's not an awful lot of peak supply, unless, of course, you consider LNG, which is now flowing into the UK again at higher rates than certainly compared to last year. I think there's 3 deliveries arriving at the Southhook terminal tomorrow. I think one from Egypt, one from the US. I'm not sure what the third one's coming in from. But this is a huge increase on last year. So the LNG terminals, which were idle for a long time, since maybe 07 or 08, they're now finally beginning to show their worth. And then, of course, we have the other supply lines, which is the interconnector from Belgium. Those long-term contracts, which were signed to underpin the financing, those all expired last year. And because of various regulatory missteps, I would say, there's no there's no guaranteed income for the pipeline operator, unlike other pipelines on the continent. So it's basically having to go to the market every time and sell incremental capacity to whoever happens to want it. I think it sold maybe a third of its 25 BCM for import flow into the UK to one big customer. No price of guessing who that is. That really is it. We're starting a probe, a House of Commons or DBIS investigation is starting today. The end user, the big industrialists are very concerned about gas supplies in the winter. They're very concerned about how much the gas will cost come March, when the storage when winter ends and gas is quite peaky. And there'll be lobbying probably the government to step in and start maybe distorting the market with some investments. So those are my observations on where we are today vis-a-vis the UK.
And just finishing the panel, my name is Julian. I'm a managing director and partner of Kerrigan. As Malcolm introduced, I head up the co-invest the investments and asset management side of the business. Kerrigan is a big investor through AJ Lucas, who's represented here today, in Quadrilla. So AJ Lucas actually has a 50% interest in the Boland Shale, which really not a lot of people actually know. It's a significant investment, and Kerrigan is a large investor there. Kerrigan is also a very large investor in iGas. So we're heavily invested both on the west coast with respect to Quadrilla, as well as on the other side of the Pennines with iGas, the other large public company that is in the space. I guess from an investor's point of view, and we'll come on to it later, I think that there is a lot of potential demand with respect to the industry moving forward. Following on from some of the themes that we heard yesterday, the industry has been in somewhat of a malaise over the last 4 years, and it's really trying to create certainty for the way forward. And that's particularly prominent with respect to the planning position with respect to the shale gas industry here in the UK, creating certainty around that to make it easy for investors. As we've been going around over a number of years raising money, we have been raising money for the industry, and we've been funding into the industry. There is a lot of interest in the space. We are waiting for those catalysts, which really is where Quadrilla is today with respect to being able to frack. And as Francis has said, there's perceived challenges with respect to the thresholds that we operate within. But I think as we'll go through, you can see that system is working, albeit it creates a lot of noise around the industry that is perhaps somewhat misplaced. But actually creating certainty to actually allow us to expedite the processes is what the industry is going to require moving forward so that we can actually fund it properly.
Julian, thank you very much for that. We'll get straight into questions because I'm sure you guys have got some interesting questions for the panel. So who's going to start us off with a question for the panel? Yeah, you'll get a microphone if you could just say who you are and where you come from.
John Scott. Question is, we see a large number of small independents, new startups, looking at small gas pockets, North Sea, Central and Southern Basin. They have perhaps the check to develop some of those assets, but haven't the check to buy infrastructure. And with the majors retreating, will infrastructure be the constraint to continue to bring forward small gas developments in the Southern Basin?
Would you like to start that, Julian?
Yeah, maybe if I start with that. I mean, Kerrigan is an investor here on onshore shale, but equally offshore. We're invested in Zenol Petroleum, which is in the East Coast. And over the last 3 or 4 years, we've actually invested in the Finlaggan project as a startup or a tieback, and then a series of other projects around that. So there's been a question over the whole of that time with respect to tiebacks to infrastructure and how long those will actually last. I think as we've seen over the last couple of years, if anything, it certainly looks as though that infrastructure is actually going to stay in place a lot longer. So we don't see that that's actually been an issue at all. What you've seen over the last 2 years has been a lot of the larger oil companies who have actually been disposing of assets, and those have been picked up by smaller companies. But those companies are actually growing and actually putting real money into the ground. So with Finlaggan, we've been drilling. We're going to have a tieback with respect to that. So, no, I think there is money. There are pockets, and there's been a lot of activity in the North Sea. Equally the same on the other side with the Norwegian side. So, again, there's been movement around of who the players are, but there's actually been a lot of pockets of investment.
I think one example is I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but it looks like Antiphon, or Antiphon. It's a French infrastructure fund. They bought out BG and BP's share of the CATS pipeline. It's all financed by long-term ship or pay contracts. So they're looking for, I suppose, well, they're telling the offshore that there's going to be capacity to get the gas to shore for a long time to come. That's all part of the maximising the economic recovery of the UK, which is a big government-sponsored drive to make sure that all the last pockets of gas that can be recovered are recovered. Because what they don't want to see happening is fields upstream being stranded by downstream pipelines being cut off.
Okay, I understand that obviously Francis wouldn't have a view on that particular question. So, next question, please, over in the centre here, please.
Hi, I'm Angus Copeland from Copeland Cardiff Asset Management. Francis, you're currently fracking 2 wells, multi-stage frack, which will take a couple of months potentially, and then test flowing after that. I'm conscious that in mid-2020 we could have a change of government, or at least there'll be at least we'll be moving to another election. What is the regulatory path for you to get some more wells drilled so that we're not just relying on those 2 test wells, that we can actually look at something like a development plan that can be in place and being operated on physically prior to that election?
That's a good question. So we have approval to drill and test up to 4 wells on that site, as you probably know. We're already preparing a development plan for that site. Obviously, it's contingent on the results of the well, but we envisage that we could be in a position to submit that to Lancashire County Council as early as next year for a production site. Lancashire politics is a bit like national politics. It's quite finely balanced, but we now have a Conservative County Council in Lancashire, very supportive, and so I would imagine, while it's not straightforward by any stretch of the imagination, we have a reasonable chance of getting that through, should we be in a position to submit a planning application next year and start the development the following year. So it could be that ahead of a general election we are progressing a development. I think that's pretty key. I mean, we all know where the Labour Party policy from the leadership is on fracking. That's not actually the if you speak to a lot of Labour MPs, you don't get that story, but that's pretty true about everything you hear from Labour. So I think it's important that we demonstrate that this is a resource that can be translated into reserves and important for the country.
And the path to regulatory approval, you think, the path to regulatory approval you feel will be again via the County Council, as opposed to, I know that you'll probably be running 2 tracks, but do you think the most likely path is via council approval, similar to last time, as opposed to sort of national approval?
I think for the first development, probably yes, because it'll probably be the same site that we're currently operating on, and there's a very well-established planning history and environmental baseline for that site now. That's not to say that in the future, if there are further sites, the national route might not be an attractive option when you get into potentially multiple sites.
And sorry, just on that one site, do you have a feeling for how long the review process would take, given that you're basically submitting the same materials you have before? And can you see a situation where you get an approval quickly and then really just every well is just an extension of the approval that could be quicker, or do you think you'll have to go for a full development approval before you can start even the 5th, 6th, 7th wells?
Again, a good question, and it's partly how do you want to do it. I think from our perspective, it's preferable to have a full approval and then flexibility to drill wells within that approval, rather than seeking to salami slice an approval process. The site itself can take probably close to 30 wells, so there's a lot of running room on that one piece of land alone without going anywhere else. if you can drill wells of 2 and 2.5 kilometres, we'll see what the recovery per well is, but that's potentially a lot of gas coming out of 2 football pitches in Lancashire.
And can you see a situation where you have the infrastructure to be drilling more than one well at a time, or is that really pushing it a bit too much?
That will undoubtedly come, but I think for the first pad, we'll probably be drilling one well at a time. We'll probably drill them in batches, drill a batch, frack a batch, tie it in, generate revenue, drill another batch, frack another batch, which is typical US development scenario.
And you still plan to flare for 6 months, or can you see a situation where you get some flows in the first couple of months, doesn't make sense to keep flaring, and potentially you put the infrastructure in to hook up to the grid?
Yeah, we've got permission to flare up to 6 months. In fact, we've got permission to flare up to 360 days, and then we can allocate that across 4 wells as we see fit. We'll flare for the minimum amount of time that we need to establish, 1, composition, and 2, enough flow rate data to make a sensible decision about where we want to drill, how many wells we want to drill. So 6 months is kind of indicative. It's not fixed in stone.
Maybe just
I'd
add.
hear the other views on the panel about the political side.
It's more to add to some of the comments that Francis had. So I think having an investment both in iGas and seeing what they're doing, and having an investment in Quadrilla and seeing what Quadrilla's doing. If you look back, Quadrilla applied for this Preston New Road site to actually drill, frack and test. All of the other companies ended up looking for vertical drilling first as an approval, then they were going to go and do a horizontal drilling approval, then it was in stages, and then they were going to frack. Quadrilla's been clearly the litmus test and the lightning rod as we've gone through all of that process, and that's taken time. But where we're at is Quadrilla's actually probably 2 years ahead of the rest of the industry in many respects, because it's actually got to that point that it's actually fracking now. And then, as Francis says, we'll be looking for flow tests. So I think the rest of the industry will catch up, as well as there are papers into the government now about how do you move this to a national infrastructure. How many wells would you need with respect to this being deemed to be a national infrastructure project once we've shown that there are flows? So nothing at the moment. This is all a sort of a scientific experiment in the eyes of everybody until we can show that it actually flows. And then, as Francis says, he's for the last 5 years he's been sitting in really the media world, not actually in the oil and gas world. When we actually start connecting, we actually connect next year to the grid, and we actually start pumping gas into people's homes. This is actually, it's creating heat, it's creating, cooking availability with respect to people's housing. It's also creating a lot of jobs. I think one of the things that we don't think about is how big the industry can actually be. So the government clearly is going to want to move things forward, and it's lined up to start to do that. It just takes time. So, again, as Francis says, easiest is really to go to where we were with the Town and Country Planning Act for the approvals, because it's going to take time to put in some of these other regulatory approvals. We've gone through a hiatus of appeals and delays and goodness knows what over the last 4 years. That doesn't happen moving forward. So, as you move to a site that has already been developed, the site is already actually there. As Francis says, you can take 30 wells on the site. We don't need to put in new foundations with respect to the site. So the approval to move forward should be a lot easier, as well as the government has put in place with respect to that Town and Country Planning Act much tighter restrictions with respect to how quickly people need to respond. So during the course of next year, those approvals need to be in place so that we have a development pad for 2020.
William, any comments on the political side of it, William?
Well, the politics are, as Francis says, it's all about politics these days. Facts are very much pushed to the side. It's about emotions, and it's about, it's very hard to explain to somebody that it's not going to affect the water table because people got it into their heads that it does. That film, which I've forgotten his name now, but called Gasland, which famously had that flame coming out of a tap. Everyone believed that was a direct consequence of shale gas. And there are states, I think New York has had a moratorium on fracking, so it's not only an English or a British problem. It's very hard to sell these ideas to the public, even though you've got jobs, you've got balance of payments, you've got industry, you've got manufacturing. All these things will benefit from a cheap source of, well, not cheap exactly, but a domestically produced source of gas that doesn't come with all the political negatives that gas from Russia or the gas from Qatar might bring with it. So, although common sense says you should use your own resources first, it's explaining to the public that is very difficult because they are obsessed with this idea of electrification. They believe that you can go almost in a week's time, it'll all be electrons, and molecules will somehow become redundant, and we can rely entirely on so far, entirely non-dispatchable renewable power for your, your schools and your hospitals and everything else you need. So.
Okie dokie. Next question from the audience, please. Right in the middle again.
Hello, it's Richard Hale from SP Angel. We're on a political theme, I suspect, and the gas industry here seems to be an industry of two halves. The offshore, I think, is something which is dictated to by industry and policy and works within expectations as one would hope and expect. The onshore, though, is caught up in the political mire, which a number of comments have been made about. Clearly, people like INEOS and Quadrilla are at the forefront of pushing that envelope and trying to get things done. But the big question is there the political will to support you, given a lot of these issues are at grassroots level at local councils, and in fact, is the government doing enough at the national level to actually facilitate the process? It's easy to do offshore to some extent because you don't have the same issues. The onshore, though, as some of you have already indicated, is problematic. So is the government doing enough?
Who would like to take that first? Francis, I hate to keep asking you to lead on this one, but...
Well, I mean, that question is always asked, and the answer is the government's never doing enough if you're if you're looking for something from the government. But I've been in this job for 6 years, and I think I've had 12 energy ministers in 6 years. So one of the issues is just continuity of personnel within government, and of course, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realise that the government is consumed by Brexit right now. So getting attention on anything else is quite difficult. The current energy minister, Claire Perry, has been a huge supporter of shale gas and is doing a lot, I have to tell you. Enough to get us drilling and fracking wells, which is what we need to do. And I think it really is now down to us and the rest of the industry to demonstrate that it's worth the government doing more. We need to show some flow rates. We need to show that this thing can produce in commercial quantities. And back to the earlier question, when you do that, it gets difficult even for, a potential Labour government to say we're going to ship it across the Atlantic or ship it from North Africa rather than, produce it from Lancashire. Don't know if that answered the question, but...
Yeah,
Julian?
I mean, maybe just adding to it, I mean, unlike the offshore industry, there are a lot more government departments involved. So the fact that you've got the local communities involved clearly adds another added complexity. So there's not one central body in the UK that is in charge of everything. And going back 5 or 6 years ago when the House of Lords actually looked at its recommendations, one of those ideas was to actually put this all within a central area. Ultimately, that's probably what will end up happening, but it's how you end up getting to that process. So unfortunately, it's a sort of a timing as we've moved from where we are with pulling lots of different strands. And it's very easy to forget, actually, a lot of things have happened. Even going back to the rights of trespass when we were drilling under the land, that actually required changes of laws to go through. So a lot has happened. Sitting as an investor, it feels like snail's pace for a lot of the time, and yes, you'd like it much quicker. You do have the opposition with respect to, or there are issues with respect to the planning issues. I mean, so the fact that we didn't have in local planning, minerals rights with respect to shale gas because nobody had thought about it 15 years ago. That needed to be put in place. I mean, so where we're at is road use, noise, issues. The reality is, and I think, Quadrilla is absolutely at the fore of this, and if you look at the site they've got, has done absolutely everything in a unbelievably well-prepared way that, most of the locals are actually in that area actually understand. They may not necessarily like Quadrilla as a company, but they actually know that Quadrilla is operated as an absolute first-class citizen, corporate citizen. That doesn't mean that you don't have, a grassroots level of people who are opposed, and that's the headlines you get. But that is not the reality of what's happening on the ground. That's the crowd that is brought in every now and again.
In the interest of balance, you have to have an anti-fracker with a scientist, which isn't really, that's the BBC approach, isn't it? You always have to have a balanced debate. So you have to have somebody on there who's not necessarily talking much sense, but because he's, to present the other side of the picture. And his views are often quite colourfully expressed and evocative images of destruction and death in the north of England. And, I don't want that. But it goes unchallenged.
Understood. Enough. Another question from the audience, please. Oh, yep. No worries.
Sorry to ask again. Sorry, Francis, can you just give us a bit of an update about the traffic light system, which has, is a pretty tight system? What happens as you go through these different levels? What levels would potentially cause quadrilla to some concern? And how you see the traffic light system developing, because it's understandable to a degree for the first well ever fracked, but we probably can't live with this traffic light system for every well to be developed in the UK.
I think you've just summarised my argument, actually. So, what would you like me to say? If you come to our site and you watch a frack, it's probably the most monitored frack ever. Schlumberger had to put an extra server into their Houston office to pick up all, and I'm serious, to pick up all the microseismic data that we're collecting. So we are monitoring microseismicity down to minus levels, because it's a log scale, so that is a real event, albeit tiny, and therefore we're probably creating the most comprehensive picture of fracturing that's ever been done in a shale. So the positive news is the fracture network is excellent. The rock is fracturing in quite a complex way, as we'd like it to. The not so good news is, as you've no doubt seen, we're rocking Blackpool with earthquakes, according to the Daily Mirror, or we're breaching the 0.5 limit occasionally in reality. So the impact for us operationally is primarily, well, it's two things. One is time, because if we breach a 0.5, we're required under the current regulation to stop pumping and monitor for 18 hours. And then we start again. So that's a slow process, and in my view, it's not sustainable. Exactly as you said, we'll demonstrate that we can do this under the current traffic light system, and we'll get a set of results. But ultimately, those results will be significantly better if that traffic light system is operated in a manner consistent with where it would be elsewhere, probably at a level of about a 2. I mean, it's typically higher than that. The Canadian state of Alberta has got an amber. Our amber is 0, their amber is 2, our red is 0.5, their red is 4. So that's probably one end. Geothermal projects, interestingly, in the UK don't have any traffic light system, and they're injecting directly into faults, because that's what geothermal projects do, and no doubt are recording seismicity in excess of 1. So there's a conversation to be had once the rocking Blackpool headlines have kind of subsided and become Blackpool's fish paper, and then we can talk sensibly about what this should be.
Thank you very much, Francis. We have a question over here on the right, please. You need to hear. I'm afraid it's being recorded.
Thank you. Just a quick question to Julian and Francis. How big do you think this industry can be in 5 to 10 years in terms of gas production and also kind of jobs and tax revenues?
I mean, I think that people have, whether it's within 5 years or what the time frame is, I don't know. But I mean, the estimate is clearly tens of billions of dollars can be invested in the industry. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs can be created within the service industry. And then the tax revenues that will flow from that. I mean, the resource, I don't think anybody has a concern with how large the resource is. It's massive across the whole of the Boland Shale. The issue is really creating certainty around being able to actually invest. So, as Francis was just picking up on the last point, in the US, a typical company would be fracking 20 times a day. We're doing 1 a day because we then have to stop for a 16-hour period to come back. Those are the things that need to change. As we had other questions, we need to be able to move to an industry where we've actually got multiple drills working at the same time. What is different with this in the UK is that from a footprint point of view on the surface, it's very small because of the thickness of the rock. And that's something that, it distinguishes enormously, as well as the amount of infrastructure that is actually around. So unlike the US, where a lot of infrastructure needs to be put in place, there's already a lot that is already there previously from the transmission systems, grid systems, etc. It really is a matter of actually demonstrating, as we keep saying, we've got to make this a really boring industry. So if we can do that, and we're going to get to that point. So if you look over the last 10 days, Quadrilla's created, 25 of the last 26 earthquakes, according to the British Geological Survey. So in another 2 weeks' time, there won't be a single earthquake that is recorded that is not a quadrilla caused event, in which point the information the British Geological Survey is putting out is meaningless. Because what you want to know is, we know that these are man-made events, we know they're going to happen. It then becomes non-news, it becomes boring. Somehow we've got to get to a stage where that then doesn't get recorded and we move beyond that, actually life is normal. When we're actually producing gas and 30 wells off a site, that's an awful lot of revenue that's going to be going to that local community. It's a lot of taxes that goes to the community. Every farmer is going to want us on their land because, after Brexit and you start changing a number of other things, so subsidies start coming off of agriculture and such like, this is going to be really important for Lancashire, as well as all the jobs that are going to be created.
I'll just add just a little bit. I think if you strip away the kind of the media, the politics, the regulations, all the rest of it, ultimately you have a world-class resource sitting next to a market that's in sharp decline supply-wise. It's like the law of gravitation. Those two are going to attract each other, and they're very close together. We talked about getting gas from offshore through the pipelines to onshore in the UK or the southern North Sea. The pipelines here are different. The pipelines are regulation, government, media, all the rest of it, which is what we've been clearing out. Once that pipeline is open, which I'm convinced it will be, as long as this gas flows, this will be very big, because it's just fundamental supply and demand. It's not more complicated than that.
All we don't know is so far is how much it's going to cost to produce that gas, and whether we can't get gas more cheaply elsewhere. That's the sort of, assuming this all works as Francis hopes it will, then the question is how cheap would it be, and how much scale do you need to bring the costs down, and so on. Otherwise, LNG might just come in and.
Which is that's our job. When we leave the media industry, that's our day job, is to say, and if we can't make gas from Lancashire flow into a pipeline that's 200 meters away more cheaply than you can produce it in Texas, liquefy it, put it in a ship, take it across the Atlantic, degasify it, put it in the NTS, take it up to Lancashire, take it out again, then we shouldn't be in a job.
Yeah, we're going to hold you accountable to that, Francis.
Please do.
Further questions from the floor? I'll just put one in myself while we're waiting for any more questions, because William mentioned, I'm talking about gas storage here, and William mentioned that Rough is no longer able to store gas. One or two of you may have noticed that in the last few months, Infrastrata appears to have been re-emerging as a play with the Island McGee gas storage facility in Northern Ireland. And I, for one, remember looking at Island McGee, I thought 10 years ago, probably a lot more. I'd like to start with William and ask the others, what do you think about the gas storage situation? And as far as I can see, there are only two ways of doing it. One is that the industry have been saying for years that we need to have gas storage, but it's the government who have to pay for it. And of course, the government have been saying, if you need storage that badly, the industry should pay for it. So, William, why don't you kick us off on gas storage?
Well, for the last, I suppose, 20 or more years, storage has always been the responsibility of the shippers who have customers to book it. That's been the EU, the UK approach. On the continent, there's a bit of a mixture. Some governments, like Hungary, Poland, they basically make it either compulsory to book storage, or you can't trade, you can't ship gas to end users. Britain has always said, no, the market must provide it. The market has to send signals. You need to have storage. In order to have storage to invest in it, you need to have a decent summer-winter price differential. And that's been squeezed so tightly over the last, 10 years or so, that now storage operators are, on the continent at least, have more than they know what to do with. When you close it down, that of course brings up the price a little bit at all the other sites, because you're creating a little bit more scarcity. The government hasn't yet been convinced, though, of the need to invest taxpayers' money in storage. It's preferred to wait until there's a real crisis, which so far hasn't actually happened. We've come very close to Rough, in the image, running out of gas within a matter of hours. Those sorts of headlines have been quite sort of dramatic. But the price hasn't gone up terribly high, and it hasn't really affected end users. It's only really affected people who trade gas on the day on the very short-term market. So there's been a bit of hysteria about the need for storage, a bit of sort of emotional attachment. You have to have our own storage. But so far, that hasn't proved the case. Now, there's an investigation starting now that, with the business energy industrial strategy. They've started a probe today where the end users will basically say, we want to have storage built, but whether they're going to pay for that's another matter. Typically, the end users are very good at demanding everything, but not paying for it. They expect it to be given to them on a plate by the government. So whether Ireland McGee can make it work now, they had to hurry, of course, didn't they, because they got the EU subsidies, and will we get those in 6 months' time is uncertain. There's also a question as well how Britain will be after Brexit. What will happen to tariffs and interconnectors? Will Norway sell gas to us at the same price at the NBP, or will it be at a premium? There's all sorts of uncertainties which we just don't know about because the deal with the EU isn't yet finished. Will we be part of the internal energy market? Until those are known, we don't know what terms we'll be able to access capacity on the continent, and therefore the price of storage is kind of unknowable. So, yeah, I mean, investing in storage now doesn't make any sense unless you have a government willing to put money into it and basically underwrite it, as they do with lots of other forms of energy, such as wind farms and through subsidies, through higher bills from customers. All the money gets clawed back in a kind of subsidised way. No one's really putting their money where their mouth is in most forms of new energy infrastructure, be it power generation or in storage.
Any comments, Julian?
Just some general comments from any investor's perspective. I mean, again, money will follow a decision if they can see that there's certainty around an investment. From a regulatory point of view, they can look at the risks and they can look at the returns. So if you can see that, that will make sense. At the moment, there's probably a lot of uncertainties, and hence, storage is either ships actually on the high seas, frankly, or pipelines coming from Eastern Europe, from Russia, etc. I mean, the biggest storage, frankly, is gas in the ground that we've actually got as well. So, I mean, it really depends on what you're looking to take. But I mean, for any of these to actually move forward, it's certainty around the regulatory environment, and to try and actually stimulate investment, it needs to be expedited.
William, you mentioned in your opening remarks that there are 3 cargoes of LNG coming to Milford Haven tomorrow, and with different countries sending them, US and Egypt and so on. Does that mean that historically people have always said, "Oh my God, it's only Russia and Norway, and the occasional shipment from Qatar"? Is this? Do you think this is the opening up of gas coming into the UK via LNG?
I think certainly the world has become a lot bigger in terms of global markets. It used to be that it was all done on long-term contracts, and it was all done by, if not by government agreements, then it was with utilities who were state-owned, and they faced no competition in their own markets, particularly in Japan, South Korea, and so on. What's happening now is a lot of companies are coming in and arbitraging away the inefficiencies that the majors created, and traders are also buying long-term capacity in the US and other LNG facilities. What this means is there's a huge amount of LNG coming onto the market from the US, also from Qatar is going to expand its capacity there by about 40%. Sorry, more than that, another 40 million tons possibly in the next sort of 5 or 6 years. So there's a huge amount of LNG coming to market. LNG itself is becoming much more tradable or fungible because it's a cargo as a cargo. A lot of it may change hands 3 or 4 times before coming to market. Egypt, of course, has the Zohr field. There's another possible giant also sitting just offshore Egypt. There's a vast amount of gas, basically, which currently is stranded, but which new technology, such as floating production storage, is beginning to make commercial, such as the Ichthys project came on stream very recently off Australia. I think they're doing the same thing as well off Mozambique with the first one, Coral LNG, possibly Tok 2 on the other side of Africa. That could become an FLNG project as well. So there's a huge amount of LNG, not that far away from Europe, about to come onto the oceans, and that is bound to have an effect on the way people see gas. They see it as being less like it used to be and more like oil. People become more confident about it and less kind of needing to have it hitched to the oil price. And generally, yeah, there's a huge opening up, I think, of the gas market, which is only about sort of 4 or 5 years away before there could even be a global price for gas. It's rather than a series of regional hub prices like the Dutch and the American and the JKM for Japan.
William, thank you very much for that. The red light is flashing in front of me, so it's almost time to bring this interesting conversation to a close. I'm going to ask the panelists just a sentence or two each on their thoughts they've taken from today. And I'm going to start with Francis, because I've always wanted to say, the final question, it's been a very long road so far, Francis. At this stage, has it been worth it?
That reminds me of the same question asked about the French Revolution 200 years after the event, and the answer was it's too early to tell, which is probably the same for where we are. It is actually too early to tell.
Thank you for your contribution. William?
Yeah, I think we're entering a new era. I always say this, we're always at a crossroads, aren't we? We either go left, right, or we keep going. But I think we are at a big turning point now in the gas market. There's a huge liberalisation movement going on. The Japanese and other countries are ending the destination clauses in contracts. Oil is becoming, or gas is becoming far more like oil. It's only the storage cost of it, which is the drawback. And markets are liberalising, and technology is making it easier to use, easier to offload it, easier to produce it, easier to ship it. There's going to be less and less stranded gas. So yeah, I think gas is very exciting. However, whether that means that necessarily Quadrilla has a license to make money is another matter.
Well, I think that comes down to Quadrilla's got to be able to manage the costs as we move forward. So, there'll be prices. At the end of the day, as Francis says, you've got to liquefy, you've got to transport, and then you've got to regasify. I mean, that all costs money. So, the UK stands in a very interesting position. There's an opportunity for a very large industry here, if the community as a whole actually takes the reins on this, and if the government takes the reins. Hopefully, that's where we'll actually be. So, yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. I think you'll agree it's been a fascinating discussion this morning, and I'm extremely grateful to our three panelists, Francis Egan, Julian Ball, and William Powell. And thank you very much indeed for staying here and asking questions. It's been a very, very good morning session. Thank you.